In the following days, Jaebon was invited by her supposed lover, Yi-jun, for a night out, possibly to watch a movie, see a musical, or have a meal. There were no issues now, as she was single. However, on the same day, Jaebon was planning to win her back. His friend and colleague recommended that to win back his wife's heart, he should start with flowers and soap. Jaebon went to buy sunflowers, which symbolized love and admiration. That night, as planned, Jingon was out with her charming companion Ki-jun, who was going to pick up the car before they left. While she was alone, she thought that perhaps with him they could make a good couple. However, despite these thoughts, she still felt empty inside. Suddenly, Jaebon appeared and asked if she had time to go somewhere that night. At that moment, Ki-jun arrived to pick her up. He told her to get in or they'd be late. Jaebon felt bad, wondering if he should have asked before coming. Disappointed, he left, just wanting to thank her for what happened before. He left, telling her that he was right, perhaps it was best they never saw each other again. In the following days, Jaebon, as always, remembered the date of his father-in-law's death. He visited his grave and asked for forgiveness, admitting that he hadn't been a good husband and that he had divorced his daughter. A little later, he talked to his friend, feeling frustrated because he hadn't given her the flowers. He wanted to do more, but Jaebon remained silent. However, his friend said something that caught his attention. He told Jaebon that, in a relationship, sometimes you need to give in because you can't always go against the person you love. But his friend couldn't advise him properly unless he told him what had happened. Finally, Jaebon opened his heart. He confessed that he had seen his wife with her work colleague making plans together. That's why he had thrown the flowers away. His friend understood that his wife was no longer wasting time on him, and since they were no longer together, everything was over. But when Jaebon heard this, he reacted. To him, nothing was over yet. He ran after Jungon, reaching her workplace. He sent her a message, asking for just 5 minutes of her time. She wasn't willing to meet him. But Jaebon is not one to give up. He flooded her with messages, shortening the time he gave her each time. He ran to see her, but as soon as she saw him, she screamed, "Are you crazy?" She was furious and wanted to fight. Jaebon finally handed her the sunflowers and apologized, knowing he hadn't been there for her father's remembrance. He knew it wasn't easy to forgive, but at least she could accept the flowers and do whatever she wanted with them. He only wanted to give her something he had never given her before. After that, he left, leaving Jingon completely confused. She remembered that every time they fought, they would end up thinking about separating, but it never happened. Perhaps that's what was happening now. Maybe there was still love between them. Meanwhile, Jaebon's mother was at a medical checkup and received news that left her terrified. She had stomach cancer, and it was already in its 4th stage. The hardest part now was telling her family. That evening, Jaebon held a meeting with his brothers to drink, and he told them that he wanted to get back with Jingon, something that seemed crazy, but he didn't care. At that moment, Jaebon's mother called him, wanting to see them since they were drinking. She joined them soon after and saw her son so happy. She sat beside them, but suddenly she told them that Jaebon wanted to get back with Jingon. This surprised them, but she was furious. She began yelling at her son, saying that if he had behaved better, they would never have separated. Then came the moment when she had to tell them what was happening. She drank a glass of wine and suddenly told them about her cancer. She shared everything the doctor had informed her, that her illness was advanced. The only thing left to do now was to start chemotherapy as soon as possible, and she was determined not to give up. Upon hearing this, Jaebon thought it was a joke and he walked away because he couldn't process it. Jaejun followed him, and his mother knew they would have to accept it soon. But today, she at least wanted to talk to Jingon. She shared how her sons, Haejun and Jaebon, grew up in a good home, with food, clothes, and nothing lacking, but it was different for him. She had promised Moonjun, Yomin's mother, that she would raise her son as if he were her own, but she couldn't fulfill her promise. What she regretted the most was that when he studied in France, she knew he suffered due to a lack of many things, yet she still believed in his words and trusted that he was doing well. She had always wished that one day he would start calling her Mum. She was very greedy. At that moment, Joming told her it was time to go home. He took her in a taxi, and once they arrived, he got out with her. He didn't want to talk and asked her to enter the house. Seeing him so serious, she left. She was already in the elevator when Joming stopped her. She knew he was about to say something, and what she heard was "Mum." Terrified, he told her not to die and not to apologize, because if it hadn't been for her, he would have been dead a long time ago. His mother was moved, hugged him, and told him to calm down, saying, "Don't worry, son, your mum won't die." After seeing his mother, he called Jia. When she came to see him, she found him very distressed. She immediately tried to cheer him up, but upon seeing his face, she understood that something was wrong. He only thought about his mother and couldn't understand why she also had to go. He begged Jia to kill him, saying he couldn't breathe and needed salvation. On the other hand, Jaebon wasn't doing well either. He arrived at Jingon's house, overwhelmed, and punished himself, saying that all of this was a punishment for being selfish. He begged Jingon for help because he wasn't okay. The next morning, the three musketeers went to the hospital to find out what was really happening with his mother and what the next steps were. The doctor tried to explain everything to them, but he didn't give them much hope. Only about a 10% chance of surviving this type of cancer. However, nothing was certain. Some patients in stage 1 couldn't survive and died, while others, even in the terminal stage, managed to extend their lives longer than expected. They had to wait and hope for a miracle. After hearing all of this, the three of them were overwhelmed, but they trusted that together they could beat cancer. That night, Jaebon went to visit his mother. But as soon as he entered, he found Jingon leaving. His mother explained that she had come to help her pack her things to take her to the hospital, as she had experience because her father had spent a lot of time in the hospital. After hearing all of this, Jaebon ran after Jingon. He wanted to know how she had found out, and she explained that she had never lost contact with her mother. She had divorced him, not her mum. After hearing this, he understood that he also needed to get closer to his mother. The next day, he arrived at his ex-mother-in-law's restaurant and, of course, she was furious. He asked for food, and although she gave him the worst service possible and even added salt to his meal, Jaebon continued eating, thinking that it was meant to hurt him. She started yelling at him, not understanding why he came to visit when he never showed up before, but he remained firm. Seeing her so upset, he kneeled before her and apologized, finally realizing how foolish he had been. On his mother-in-law's birthday, he had only given her a money envelope and told her to take it and stop bothering him. He admitted that he hated the soup she made and apologized for all the thoughtlessness he had shown toward everyone. He finally understood how wrong he had been. The next day, Jiomin arrived at work and noticed that Jia wasn't there. He felt horrible, remembering everything he had said to her and not knowing what to say or do now. Just then, Jia walked in and talked to him as if nothing had happened. But today, Jia asked if she could work alone in her office for the day. He stayed by her side all day, following her wherever she went, but when they reached the men's bathroom, he couldn't enter. Jia was waiting for him outside. Eventually, he asked her to tell him what she thought of him following her all day. He asked, "Would you mind if I followed you everywhere, even to the women's bathroom?" Jia responded that she would feel loved. Jomin couldn't take it anymore and left. Jia added, "I will never leave you. Even if you're angry, shout at me or push me away. I will never leave your side." Amid tears, she pleaded, "Please, boss, don't die, and never say those awful things to me again." He hugged her and asked her to forgive him, promising he would never think about death again. Days passed, and Haiyun, Io's daughter, kept insisting to Jomin that he give her the phone number of his friend Haijun. But Jomin had repeated countless times that she wasn't suitable for his friend and that he wouldn't give her the number. She retorted, pointing out that she was rich, from a good family, beautiful, and had a professional career. But to him she lacked the most important thing, kindness. And above all, she needed to be cured of her kleptomania. For her, this was unfair. Why was he judging her without even knowing her? But she started playing along with this game. They began to argue, and since Jiamin never holds back, he told her that the day she became president, he would resign. He then kicked her out of his office. Outside, the gossiping Kiva X was already spreading the latest rumor. Apparently, the CEO of the company wanted her boss to be her son-in-law. This news infuriated Jia. She stormed into her boss's office, but he didn't understand what she wanted to ask. She immediately locked the door and approached him to mark her territory. After seeing his reaction, she was sure he loved her, and only her. Days later, Ha-jun was in the park with Sol when one of the children shouted at Sol, saying she didn't have a mum. Sol insisted she did, and then Jia approached. She had gone for a walk and gently held Sol. Sol called her mum, and Jia explained to her that she wasn't her mother. But Sol, being quick-witted, pointed out the child, and Jia quickly understood, winking at Ha-jun to continue this little lie. That night, Ki-jun was going out with Jin-jun, planning to invite her to dinner. But B wasn't giving up easily. Seeing her with Ki-jun, he called her without hesitation and once again handed her flowers, this time red roses, symbols of love and passion. He told her he had been thinking of words he should have said to her after losing their baby. She didn't want to talk about it, but Ki-jun understood everything. He told her he would wait for her in his car, but Jaebon, after leaving, continued to speak, telling her that their baby was now in a better place and that none of this was her fault. Hearing this, she cried, not fully understanding why, but Jaebon did. She needed to hear those words from his mouth. That was all she needed to feel better. Seeing her cry, he approached and embraced her. Meanwhile, Jia returned home. As she got off the elevator, she saw Ha-jun lying at the entrance, drunk. Jia, as always, was worried and approached him, asking about Sol. He told her Sol was with her grandfather, but Jia couldn't understand why he was drinking, what was going on with him. He wanted to tell her about his mother, but it was difficult. Jia asked him not to share it if he didn't want to. But then Jan apologized, saying he was acting like a fool simply because he didn't know how to manage his emotions. This time he would willingly accept the punishment, and he ended up kissing Jia. She pushed him away, but he insisted. The worst part was that Jiamin arrived and saw everything. Jia quickly pushed him away, but Jiamin understood the situation. Jia wanted to explain and apologized for what he saw, but Jia wanted to explain and apologize for what he saw, but Jia wanted to want her apology because it wasn't her fault. Instead, he apologized on behalf of Jawn. Meanwhile, Jia wanted permission to beat him up. Of course, she could, but not to the point of killing him since he had a daughter. The next morning, the time for the judgment arrived. Fortunately, Jia wasn't the type to forget his mistakes because of alcohol. He knew he did something wrong, and Jiamin didn't want his apology. He just wanted to understand why he did it. Why the hell did he do that? That night, Jiamin hadn't come home. Even some of his belongings were missing. He was worried about the situation, and the only thing he could think of was going to see Jia to apologize. She asked him, "You know my boss and I are in a relationship, right?" Of course, he knew. He said he had drunk too much that day, but Jia wasn't satisfied with that explanation. She didn't want his apologies or excuses. If he wanted to end her anger, he needed to allow her to slap him twice. She accepted and gave him one slap for humiliating her and another for humiliating her friend. With that, she restarted his system to see if he ever thought of doing such foolish things again. He could even lose his friend over this. On the other hand, Haeun had fought with her mother. She was always insulting and humiliating her for not being like her. Haeun was fed up with this and went to a bar to drink, but unexpectedly she ran into Jiamin. When she asked for her friend's number, Jiamin gave it to her. He didn't care anymore. Jiamin thought a lot about it. Haeun had told him they were family, but did family do these kinds of things? He started talking to Haeun and shared how, at his graduation, Jan had made his family go on a trip and came alone to congratulate him. He gave him a bouquet of flowers, and how could he turn that down? But he never thought Jan would betray him like this. 4 days passed, and finally, Jiamin returned home. Jawn was worried, but then Jiamin knelt before him. He had thought a lot and came to the conclusion that he couldn't take him out of his life, but he also couldn't take Jia out. He begged Jawn to accept it and not to look for Jia anymore. Haeyeon approached and, hugging him, promised to do so. He deeply regretted everything. The next day, Haeyeon felt better. He was calm, but still tired. That's when Miss Mo arrived to see him. She found him asleep and wondered, should I kiss him? But of course that wasn't a good idea. When he woke up, she quickly ran away, embarrassed by her thoughts. On the other hand, Jiyomin, the boss, was in a meeting where Jia was presenting her new idea to publish in the magazine. But suddenly, Jiyomin said, "Jia, do you love me?" Everyone was surprised, and in the face of such a declaration, the boss called them slow. Jia tried to ask him not to say anything, but he could no longer separate his private life from his work life. He thought it was best for everyone to know, as it would lift a weight off his shoulders. So he publicly declared that he and Director Yu were seeing each other. After that, he left, leaving poor Jia stuck in a huge mess. She ran after him, and when she caught up, he asked her to step aside and talk for a moment. Once they were alone, he told her about his first love, Jejin, Jan's sister. She was Sol's mother, but after dying in an accident, Sol became Jan's responsibility. However, when Jaeban and Jun told him that Jia resembled Jejin, he was confused. He had never noticed it before and didn't understand if his feelings for her had developed because of that resemblance or if he was truly interested in her. He didn't want to hurt her, so he had been observing her for a while. He couldn't understand why she never asked him about it, but Jia didn't like to pressure anyone into revealing something they weren't ready to share. Then Jima told her, "You don't look like Jejin. With her, I felt like dying, but with you, I want to live." Days passed, and one afternoon, Ja's mother was helping a customer in the shoe store where she worked. When the customer asked her for assistance, Ja accidentally made the woman's expensive handbag fall, causing a scratch. The woman blamed Ja for the damage and demanded that she pay 5 million won. What the woman didn't expect was that Jamin had arrived and witnessed the injustice. He intervened, carefully examined the bag, and ended up exposing the situation. Ji's mother thanked him, but he took the opportunity to introduce himself. They had met before. He was her daughter's boyfriend. Ji's mother asked why he had come to see her, and he explained that he wanted to win her favor. He knew Jia could be with a better man than him, but if her future mother-in-law went to his workplace, everyone would likely tell her that they didn't like him. He never cared about what others thought of him, but now he wanted her to teach him how to be better. Meanwhile, Jingjon was in turmoil. Jan had confessed his feelings to her and asked her to stop being just friends and become something more, but she couldn't respond. She felt a knot in her throat and everything became clear to her. She thought she would forget everything after separating from Jaebon, but it was even harder. She thought about him day and night. Then her mother called her, and soon after Jingjon went to see her mother, or rather, Haebon. They were fighting, and neither was willing to give in, but then she heard that he came every day and her mother was fed up. Jaebon had no idea that his mother-in-law had called Jinjun. When they were face to face, they decided to sit and talk. She wanted to know what was going on with him, and suddenly he blurted out, "I love you." Jinjun didn't understand why, but he confessed that despite everything, he still loved her deeply. The next day, on the runway, Jiyomin was receiving details about the new magazine. He was furious, on the brink of exploding and sending them all out. But he began to say, "I'm sorry, guys. It seems the one responsible for these aberrations is me." And so, he started teaching them everything they needed to know in order to deliver good work. Little by little, this became a great lesson for everyone, as they were very interested in his vast experience. Jia understood, and at that moment a message arrived. He was trying to be better for her. Ah, how beautiful love is. On the other hand, Seo Kelly was having dinner with her daughter Ha-jun, who couldn't understand why her mother hired such an arrogant person. The reason she hired him was exactly because he reminded her of herself. However, Ha-jun didn't see it that way. She arrived at her room, recalling the time she accidentally bumped into him at the bar. Seeing him vulnerable made her realize he was a great person. To her surprise, she got excited about the idea of winning him over for herself. Meanwhile, Hajun had gone out for a work dinner. As usual, they started drinking and playing a bottle game. If someone didn't answer a question, they had to drink. To everyone's surprise, it was Ms. Dummy Moon's turn. They asked if she liked anyone, and it was so obvious. She answered yes, but when the bottle spun again, it landed on her. This time they asked if the person she liked worked at the hospital. If she answered yes, they'd guess who it was because there were only 2 men in the clinic. She drank, and when the bottle spun again, it landed on her once more. She was about to drink again because it was the same question, but this time John would drink for her. Would he be her knight in shining armour? After drinking, he tried to leave, but then Dami ran after him, grabbed him, and, because he was her knight, she offered him a wish. Whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. After saying this, she ran off, leaving John very confused. In the following days, Gia's mother was having lunch with her co-workers. They were all around her age, so they gossip and complain about their sons-in-law. It seemed none of them had one worth praising. Just then Jiamin arrived. The old ladies, being curious, wanted to know who he was, and he introduced himself as the man madly in love with their daughter, and everyone envied him. But really, he had only come to earn points with his future mother-in-law, bringing coffee for everyone. Afterward, he left. And, of course, all the women wished they had such a handsome and attentive son-in-law. It seemed he finally earned some extra points with his future mother-in-law. On the other hand, Jinjon was standing in front of Kijon, but couldn't think about anything except for that, "I love you." He was about to explain to Kijon that they couldn't be together, but before he could say anything, she stopped him. She told him not to respond now. She didn't mind waiting years for a positive answer. She only wanted to spend time with him, and so she planned a dinner for that night. As evening approached, they were about to go out for dinner, but just then Jaebon opened the car door and asked Jinjon to get out and come with him. He wanted to take her out for something nice to eat. At that moment, Kijon was furious. The man who had caused her so much pain now wanted to get her back. He started talking, saying that a divorce wasn't a child's game, or maybe to Jaebon, Prosecutor Chang was just a toy. It seemed he was still an idiot. He began blaming Jaebon for everything, but all of it seemed irrelevant to her. Jinjan could no longer tolerate it, but Kijan asked her if she was going to keep letting that fool hurt her. She didn't understand why he was reacting this way, but he told her it was because he loved her. Didn't she remember that he was her soulmate, her partner? He said his heart was broken after seeing her cry so many times. This made her think back to how he had been with her but for Jaebon. This was the decisive moment, so Jinjun decided not to go with Jaebon. Meanwhile, Jia was with her mother. She wanted to talk about her boss and confessed that he had been visiting her and seemed to know how to keep secrets. Jia's mother was happy to hear that, but then she asked about Jiamin's parents, and everything started to go wrong. Jia told her that he didn't have parents. Her mother became upset, and Jia tried to explain that they had all passed away when he was a child. Her mother agreed, realizing that something was hidden in this man. That's why he had that look. That's why he was so dark. She then told Jia that before it was too late, she should separate from him. Jia couldn't tolerate her continuing to speak ill of her boyfriend. Her mother gave her illogical reasons, like that he didn't have any family to support him, and that one day the good job he had would come to an end, and he would end up nothing. These things sounded out of place to Jia. Unfortunately, she had to put her mother in her place because she didn't know her mother was so materialistic, or did she want to benefit from her marriage? Jia reminded her that she had married a wealthy man, and what happened? He abandoned her. Money, fame, and everything else didn't matter. It was about who the person was. After this argument, Jia didn't go to work the next day and took a leave of absence. Of course, Jimin missed her, but at that moment, Hajun arrived. As we saw earlier, she had become interested in Gyeomin and wanted to know what he thought of her. At first, Gyeomin thought she meant what he thought about her to introduce her to John, but she clarified that she wanted to know what he thought of her. That made him laugh. But he was furious because he really didn't understand anything. He thought of leaving, but she told him, "I wish you well," and thought about taking him somewhere unattainable. However, Gyeomin wasn't interested and asked her never to step foot in his office again. That night, Jawn was heading home with Sol, but they saw Jia alone. Sol approached her, and although she initially seemed fine, they soon realized she wasn't. Jawn immediately alerted Jiamin, and soon after Jiamin arrived. He thought she was fine and assumed her day off had been for something fun, but soon noticed she was crying. He understood what had happened. Her mother had opposed her seeing him. Jia was crying, but Jiamin wanted her to understand something. He was very clever and would eventually convince her mother. Jia told him, "I love him so much, boss." And he replied that he loved her too. The next day, as usual, Jinjun went out for a run. However, that day he was surprised to see Hubo, who never did that, running just to see her. He arrived with so much energy even though he wasn't used to it, and after a short time he was exhausted. He stopped, and at that moment, Jinjun arrived to see him. He shouted at him, asking what was wrong. Was he crazy? But Jin just wanted to do things for her because he loved her. He knew he had been a terrible husband and had made her suffer. So, he thought this time, he would take on the pain and live through what she had to suffer because of him. That's why he asked Jinjan to act as he wished. Now he would accept everything. Jinjan gave him water, and after that, Jan ran off again. Jaebon knew that this was the only way he would win her over, because he wanted to show that he was truly sorry. On the other hand, Jaya was about to kill a crazy guy who had used her card and spent millions of won on alcohol. She wanted to make him disappear because this was unforgivable. The guy opened the door and was about to escape. Just then, at the entrance, Jiamin was there. Seeing a man in his girlfriend's house, he was furious. He wanted to know who he was and gave him 10 seconds to answer. The poor guy was terrified. By the time the countdown reached 10, he screamed, "I'm Jia's younger brother." Jiamin wanted to verify this, so he asked Jia, but she denied it. She said the guy was just a thief and asked Jiamin to deal with him. After hearing this, Guillaumin had an idea. First, he wanted to know the guy's name, so he started the countdown again. "Boom," the guy said. "Jimmy knew." Guillaumin took a good look at him, then asked if he was a model or something. Jimin had tried to audition for several magazines but hadn't found any work yet. Guillaumin, seeing this, told him, "You're going to help me from now on," and took him with him. The next day, Jimin came to see his mother during lunch, but he didn't come alone. He was with Jiamin. All of Jia's mother's colleagues were delighted, especially when Jimin told her that, thanks to his brother-in-law, he had landed a great opportunity to audition for Company X. This made Jia's mother realize that Jiamin had just declared war. But in the end, who would win? Weeks passed, and Jaebon's mother, Hajin, wasn't doing well. The chemotherapy treatments were wearing her out, and she was reacting badly. She felt like this wasn't for her. Meanwhile, on the runway, they were taking photos for the new magazine. Today, CEO Kelly arrived and, being so arrogant, started bossing Jaya around, calling her little pig. "Jaya, over here! Bring water!" "Jaya, coffee!" Jiamin couldn't stand it anymore. Seeing Jia reduced to a servant, unable to focus on her real work, he confronted CEO Kelly in front of everyone, telling her that what she was doing was wrong. Her workers had designated jobs, not to run errands for her. This embarrassed CEO Kelly, but she... On the other hand, Jia was happy. She thought, "My boyfriend is the best." Later that night, Jaebon returned to visit his mother-in-law, who was completely fed up. Just that night, Jinjon arrived and saw his mother-in-law fiercely mistreating Jaebon. For some reason, he felt an immense rage, especially when he saw Jaebon cut himself on a broken plate. He screamed because he didn't understand how Jaebon could let himself be treated that way. Jinjun's mother didn't understand either. Why was Jaebon being treated like that? He had once been her son-in-law and her daughter's husband. At least she should show him some respect. They sat together and Jinjun helped treat Jaebon's wound. At that moment, Jaebon asked him not to be hard on his mother. He wondered how he would feel if his mum died. He felt like a fool for having ignored his mother's heart for so many years. He never imagined his mother would have such a horrible illness, and now he understood that she might not live for much longer. Jaebon began to cry, and Jinjun embraced him. The next day, Jiamin visited Jia. who was a bit upset with him because she found out that he always keeps things to himself, and it hurt her. Though today he wanted to apologize. He wished he had been born into a wealthy family, with great parents to care for him, with so much power that he could get rid of anyone who tried to hurt him, but he couldn't do such a thing. Jia then asked if he really considered himself an adult, because he shouldn't apologize for that, but should be proud of himself. She reminded him that, even though he doesn't have all the things he mentioned, he is wonderful just as he is. On the other hand, Jaibon was so tired, but just then his mother-in-law arrived. She didn't understand what had happened, but after hearing about the struggles in Jaibon's home, she understood that he was a great man. That day, she brought food for his mother, lightly seasoned, and food for him as well. She added that he should have faith, that all of this would pass soon. Meanwhile, Hajun was thinking about the reproaches he had made to his father. He was a doctor, and even so, he failed to realize his wife was suffering. Hajun desperately begged his father to help his mother, to save her. Just then, Damyon was about to leave the clinic when he noticed a light was still on. He entered and saw Hajun. He apologized for disturbing him, but Hajun told him he knew what to do with his wish. He asked Damyon to be his drinking buddy for the next few days. On the other hand, Jia's mother was finishing work, but it was raining heavily. She had no choice but to go out in the rain. Just then, Jiamin arrived and gave her his umbrella. He didn't want to bother her, but simply understood that there was no greater pain in the world than losing a family member. Therefore, health was the most important thing. After that, he left. That night, Jia returned the umbrella, and her mother had left a pair of shoes for Jiamin. It seemed that Jia's mother had finally understood, and that made them both very happy. Since it was Friday, what better than to take a walk together? So they went to Busan. Being completely alone was the most pleasant thing for both of them. No one would interrupt them, at least not that night. However, the next morning, while they were having breakfast, a young man, an ex-classmate of Jia's from university, appeared. He shamelessly began flirting with her. Jia didn't know what to say, but Jiamin became jealous. He introduced himself as Jia's boyfriend and asked the man to leave. Even when the man left his card for Jia to call him any time, Jia, furious with jealousy, clarified that they came here to enjoy their time together, and Jia shouldn't be looking at other men. After this sweet remark, Jia suddenly shouted, "I really want to get married!" This surprised Jiamin. After that, Jia pretended she hadn't said anything, ignoring Jiamin's repeated questions about what she had said. Meanwhile, Jaibon was drinking with his best friend, who didn't understand why he always had to push him to achieve something. What seemed illogical was understanding why he divorced if he loved her so much. He then said, "This is the last thing I'm doing for you. Take advantage of it." Just then, Jinjun arrived, as this best friend was Jinjun's brother. He left them alone, and Jaibon, lost in thought, hadn't prepared anything and didn't know what to say. However, the alcohol helped, and they talked between drinks until Jaibon was completely drunk. Seeing this, Jinjun decided to take him home. He wanted to ignore it, leave him as he was, but couldn't. He changed his clothes to make him comfortable, though when he saw him like this, he didn't understand if it was the alcohol or something else. He looked so handsome. He tried to ignore it, but at that moment Jaibon reacted, grabbed him and threw him onto the bed. He had wanted this for a long time. He told Jinjun he would give him enough time to ask him to stop, but after that he wouldn't. Jinjun didn't have the strength to fight against his heart. Finally, there was reconciliation. The next day, Seo Kelly and her daughter Hajun arrived at the runway, waiting for the chief editor. Just then, Jia arrived, and once again they asked her to bring coffee. As she approached, Seo Kelly expected Jia to apologize, and Jia understood it was for what happened before. She had no choice but to bow to her. However, to the bad luck of these women, Yomin, the chief editor, arrived. Seeing this, he ran over to Hajun, demanding she apologized for the time she stole his wallet. Hajun tried to explain that it was going to fall, but Yomin had no mercy. When he saw she wouldn't apologize, he forced her to bow before him, and her mother didn't defend her. After that, Seo Kelly ordered them to leave. Jia felt a bit sorry for Ha-jun, but couldn't do anything about it. Seo Kelly was surprised by Jeo-min's actions, not understanding why he was so determined to ruin her reputation at the company, but it wasn't that, he just hated injustice. Then Kelly understood. He defends Editor Yu because she's his girlfriend, right? Jeo-min didn't deny it, and since there was nothing at work that prevented them from being together, he didn't feel the need to explain. This disappointed Kelly, but Jeo-min didn't care. He knew he had so much influence, even in France, and warned her that if anyone dared to touch his girlfriend, he'd ruin their life. Meanwhile, Ha-jun was angry with herself for almost being swayed by that man. When she saw him so vulnerable that day, she thought he was a good person and that they could heal their wounds together. But he was nothing like she thought, just a piece of trash. On the other side, Jeo-min was waiting for Seo Kelly to leave his office. She got to her car and there she waited for her daughter, who was crying. Her mother told Ha-jun that if she wanted Editor Yeomin, her mum would give him to her. Meanwhile, at the clinic, Damien was about to inform Ha-jun that he was going home, but he tripped and Jan helped him. At that moment, he offered to take Damien home. Later, Jin-jun was leaving work when Ki-jun asked if he could accompany her somewhere to talk. She agreed, but just as they were planning where to go, Jaibon appeared. Once again, he opened the car door, asking Jin-jun not to leave with Ki-jun to stay and go somewhere together. Ki-jun didn't understand, but Jin-jun took the opportunity to ask if she was willing to get to know him better. Jaibon, feeling jealous, was going crazy. However, Jin-jun understood. He grabbed Jaibon by the shirt and told Ki-jun that this germ of society was a headache-causing bacteria, but at the same time it was beneficial. He apologized but knew that this germ would never be able to get out of his life, and now he was ready to give this germ a chance. That was the right thing to do for his heart. Weeks passed, and Hae-chun accompanied her mother to a medical checkup. It seemed that they would need to change her medication since it wasn't working. However, her mother decided to stop chemotherapy, asking how much time she had left. Later that day, Hae-chun went to see Yeomin, who was standing in the rain. Yeomin ran over with an umbrella, not understanding what was happening. Then it was announced that her mother was about to quit. She was going to abandon them from that moment on. They wrote to Jaibon, telling him that together they needed to give her a reason to keep living. Jaibon immediately called Jin-jun, asking for help with a compassionate lie. Meanwhile, Tammy was about to go out for drinks with a friend, but just then, Jun arrived and asked her to grant him one more wish, even though it might seem selfish on his part. At the same time, Jiamin arrived to see Jia, who was supposedly still working but was actually watching a soap opera. Jiamin was startled by this, but then his boss told Jia that it was time for her to meet his mother. That same night, the three ladies arrived at the door of the mothers of these three wonderful men. They all called her Mother. And she was so surprised, they gave her flowers and each introduced themselves. Except for Jin-jian, of course. His mother was very surprised. At least they could have warned her they were coming. Quickly, she ran out, and after a few hours, she got ready and prepared a grand dinner for everyone. She was so happy to meet her son's girlfriends. Damie told her that she had just started dating Ha-jun, and Sol was already calling her Mum. Although Damie was sweet and liked the idea, the most important thing for her was to see her son's happiness. Just then, Jay shared a piece of news that surprised everyone. Jin-jun was pregnant. It sounded excessive, but it made his mother so happy. Jin-jun asked her to please stay healthy so she could enjoy her grandchild, and this was more motivation for her and for all three of her beautiful sons. Days later, Jin-jun couldn't believe it. The reconciliation with Jaibon had led to an absolute truth for their compassionate lie. God was blessing them, giving them a second chance because she was pregnant. Meanwhile, his relationship with Ha-jun and Jomon was improving. However, Jomon still feared that this fool might continue pursuing Ja. Still, Ha-jun opened his eyes and told him that it seemed like Ja did have someone in her life, Ms. Damion, who was crazy about him. On the other hand, Chun was feeling terrible. She felt so lonely and, whenever she had the chance, tried to steal something. However, they soon realized it, and this time it wasn't just anyone. She had stolen from an important businessman, a known associate of her mother. Her mother quickly approached, but John called her Mum, which left the businessman stunned, making him wonder, is this woman really the daughter of the CEO? That same day felt like a call from God, or something that happened to bring them to a date on the building's rooftop. Everything was perfect. Jia and Gurmin were enjoying their time together. However, Jia suddenly saw that Ha-jun was about to jump off the building. Ha-jun was so frustrated with her life, remembering the horrible words from her mother. With every word she heard, she wanted to leave this world. But before making that crazy decision, Jiomon saved her. He asked Jia to call the CEO immediately and tell her that her daughter urgently needed to see a psychiatrist. What seemed like a heroic moment would soon turn into a nightmare. Ha-jun was upset, hurt, and filled with a desire for revenge against Jiomon. How dare he save her? The next day, Jin-jun met Jaebon for lunch. Not knowing where to start, she bluntly told him that she was pregnant. She showed him the 3 tests she had taken, and seeing this, Jaebon was overwhelmed with joy. He was so happy it felt like a dream. He ended up holding her and spinning her around. Today he was the happiest man in the world. Kneeling before her, he vowed to work hard for both of them. It seemed that everyone deserved a second chance, and now they had theirs. Meanwhile, at the clinic, Ha-jun was about to leave when Damie bravely asked to talk to him privately. She began by telling him that today marked the 3rd anniversary of her one-sided love for him, a love that he knew she had. How sweet! On the other hand, Jaebon was talking to his best friend, who also happened to be his brother-in-law. He learned that Jaebon was so lucky he was about to become a father. But the worst part was hearing that Jaebon and Jin-jon would get married again. To his brother-in-law, it sounded like a bad joke, but now he could honestly say that love had completely driven him mad. Elsewhere, Jiamin was leaving work when he ran into Ha-jun. She grabbed him and wanted to talk, but he was always cold toward her. Still, he listened to what she had to say. When she said nothing more, he told her it wasn't necessary to thank him. He understood, and then walked away, leaving her completely furious. Later, he met his mother, who was excited to visit him. She asked if her wig looked good, and of course he agreed. But then she asked her son if he was planning to marry Jia. He barely knew her, but he knew she was a good girl, and even though it might be a little too soon, Jia had already thought about it. His mother was happy to hear this because she hoped they would advance their wedding plans since she wanted to be close to her son. That day, Jiamin began to plan everything, but he asked the wrong person for help, Jiamin, the office gossip. Jiamin wanted to know what the most beautiful marriage proposals had been, and he promised to help Jiamin if he gave him an expensive watch. And so, the plan for the proposal began.